It happened before I even sat down. "Someone like you doesn't deserve to sit here," my father said. Then in front of everyone, officers, spouses, young cadets, he yanked the chair out from under me. The wooden legs scraped against the ballroom floor. For a second, no one moved. My uniform cap rolled across the carpet and stopped at a pair of polished boots. I remember the hush that fell like the air itself refused to breathe. I stood there, spine-straight, hands at my side. I didn't pick up the cap, didn't look at him. Then a voice broke the silence. "Actually, she's the highest-ranking active officer in this room." A Major Air Force, judging by the blue dress uniform, rose from his seat at the next table. He looked directly at my father, then at me, and nodded once respectfully. My father froze, his face went pale. I said nothing, I didn't need to. I turned, walked out of the banquet hall, and didn't look back. That's how it started, the last conversation I'd ever have with Colonel Richard Cole as his little girl. That night, as I drove back toward the base, I kept replaying the scene in my head. The silverware clinking, the stiff smiles, the uncomfortable shuffle of shoes when no one dared to speak. It wasn't the first time my father embarrassed me, but it was the first time he made it public. It was supposed to be a reunion dinner, a joint banquet for retired officers and their families at a country club outside Norfolk. My father had insisted I come. "It's time people see how you turned out," he'd said. I should have known better. I'd spent my whole life chasing his version of turning out right. He was Army, 26 years, 3 deployments, 1 Purple Heart. The kind of man who wore pressed khakis on a Sunday and called the flagpole in his yard sacred ground. When I joined the Navy, he said it was a branch for paperwork and PR. When I made SEAL, he said they must have lowered the standards. Still, I kept trying. I kept showing up at Christmas, at birthdays, at events like this one, hoping maybe he'd see me differently. Hoping one day I wouldn't just be the daughter who disobeyed him. At the banquet, the moment was almost cinematic. The long white tablecloths, the soft music, the small American flags in crystal vases. When I arrived, I saw him at the center table, surrounded by his old unit. They all looked the same, gray hair, squared shoulders, proud of their past. "Lieutenant Commander Avery Cole," the announcer called as I approached. Every eye turned toward me. My father didn't clap. He didn't even stand. He just watched me approach, that small smirk he used to wear when I was 10 and missed a target at the range. I reached for the empty chair next to him. That's when he did it, pulled it back with a sharp motion like swatting a fly. "You don't deserve to sit here," he said. I saw my stepmother's eyes widen. I saw an aide lower his fork halfway to his mouth. But I said nothing. Words wouldn't fix it. When the major stood up for me, I almost felt sorry for him. He didn't know the history, the 20 years behind that one sentence. When I got home that night, I hung my uniform on the back of the door. My hand brushed over the ribbons, the service pins, the trident. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every medal earned from missions my father would have called impossible for a woman. I poured a glass of water, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't angry. She was tired. Tired of the proving, the explaining, the silence that followed every success. I remembered being 13, shining my father's boots before his inspection. He'd walked in, saw me polishing, and said, "Don't waste your time learning this. You'll marry someone who does it for you." When I enlisted 10 years later, he didn't show up to graduation. He said he couldn't stomach watching a circus. The night I completed BUDS, the SEAL training program, he sent a single text, "You made it. Don't expect applause." So when he pulled that chair away, maybe it wasn't a betrayal. Maybe it was the natural end of something that had never really existed. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was Commander Morales, my former CO and mentor. He'd heard about the incident. Word travels fast in the small world of uniformed services. "Don't let one man's smallness shrink your space," he said. "You've earned your seat 100 times over. He just can't stand that you don't need his permission to sit anymore." That hit harder than I expected. I thanked him, got dressed, and went to the gym. The sound of the barbell hitting the mat drowned out the noise in my head. By the 10th rep, I wasn't thinking about the dinner anymore. I was thinking about the next mission briefing, the next team I'd lead. That's the thing about training, you learn early that pain doesn't wait for permission to pass. You push through it until it forgets your name. Still, as I ran laps on the track that evening, I caught myself glancing toward the bleachers, half expecting to see my father sitting there like he used to during high school games, arms crossed, jaw set, watching silently. But he wasn't there. He never would be again, not in the way I once hoped. And yet deep down I knew this wasn't the end. Something about that moment, the chair, the silence, the way the major looked at me felt unfinished, like a thread waiting to be pulled. Because humiliation has a strange way of becoming clarity. That night I opened a blank page in my journal and wrote a single line. He took away a chair, but I still stand taller. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was reckoning. The kind that doesn't come with shouting or slamming doors, but with proof that you can build your own place, your own peace, and invite others to sit when they've earned the right to. I closed the notebook and turned off the light. Tomorrow would be a new day, another mission, another test. But tonight the silence was mine, and for the first time in a long while that felt like victory. I didn't talk to my father after that night, not for a week, not for a month. I thought maybe he'd call, maybe apologize, or at least try to explain himself. He didn't. The silence between us stretched like a canyon, wide and dry. I stopped expecting an echo. People around me didn't ask about the banquet, but they knew. Word traveled quietly through the base how Colonel Cole humiliated his daughter, a decorated SEAL officer, in front of a room full of veterans. The story came back to me in whispers and side glances. A few younger recruits asked if it was true. I told them, don't believe everything you hear. But it was true. Every sharp word, every scrape of that chair against the floor, it was all real. I focused on my work. That's the thing about the military. It trains you to move forward no matter what happens at home. My next assignment came fast, a flood relief mission in Texas. I'd be leading a mixed branch team, Navy medics, Marine engineers, and a handful of Army logisticians. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Multi-branch ops rarely are. Too many egos, too much pride. But I wanted the distraction. I wanted to serve, to prove to myself this time that I still knew who I was. Before we deployed, I stopped by the pier early one morning. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that makes the ocean look like brushed steel. The gulls circled low and the air smelled like rain. I remember thinking he'll never see this part of me, the quiet before the duty, the pride in the calm. When I boarded the transport that afternoon, my second-in-command, Chief Petty Officer Daniels, handed me the manifest. "Looks like we're short on volunteers," he said. "We always are," I told him. "But the ones who show up are the ones who matter." We landed in Houston 2 days after the hurricane had torn through. Streets were rivers. Whole neighborhoods looked like broken toys scattered in mud. The air hummed with generators and distant sirens. We set up base in a middle school gymnasium that still smelled faintly of chalk and wet cement. For the first 3 days, I barely slept. We moved debris, repaired levees, rescued families from rooftops. I kept my mind locked on the task checklists, radio calls, supply counts. Anything but the image of my father's face when that major stood for me. On the 4th morning, I was waist-deep in water helping an elderly man climb into a rescue boat. He gripped my arm and said I thought all you SEALs were men. I smiled, handed him a blanket, and said, "You thought wrong." He laughed, one of those tired, grateful laughs that carries more relief than humor. Later that day, a levee broke upstream, and a surge of water slammed through the area. One of our trucks got caught in the current, flipped, and pinned a young boy beneath it. No time for protocol. I dove in. The water was freezing, full of debris, but instinct took over. I crawled under the truck, pulled him free, and used my belt as a makeshift tourniquet. By the time the medics arrived, the boy was breathing again. I remember his mother's face, mud-streaked, trembling, saying over and over, "Thank you, thank you." That night, while the team slept in shifts, I walked outside the gym. The floodlights made the wet streets glow silver. I leaned against a Humvee, exhausted, staring up at a sky I couldn't even see through the clouds. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped at Dad. My thumb hovered over the call button. I didn't press it. What would I even say that I'd spent the day saving lives while he spent his teaching other men how to remember theirs? That I'd found meaning in the chaos he called weakness? Instead, I texted Commander Morales. "Mission solid, team strong, weather brutal but manageable." He replied within minutes, "Proud of you, Cole. Remember, storms reveal the steady ones. I smiled a little at that. He always knew how to say just enough. 2 days later, a news crew showed up. They were covering American heroes in the flood zone. I tried to avoid the cameras, but one caught me kneeling beside that same boy, helping him into an evacuation van. The photo ran in the local paper. Navy SEAL commander saves child in flood. A week later, the image made its way onto national television. People called me a hero. I didn't feel like one. Heroes don't get to choose their moments, they just survive them. When the mission wrapped, the team gathered for debrief. Daniels clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You run a tight ship, ma'am. The men respect you." "Good," I said. "Respect's better than applause." On the flight home, I stared out the window as the clouds parted over the Gulf. For a brief moment, sunlight spilled through, golden and soft. I thought about my father again, how he would have reacted if he saw that photo. Maybe he did. Maybe he tore it out of the newspaper, or maybe he turned the channel before my name was mentioned. When I landed, there was a voicemail waiting on my phone. It wasn't from him. It was from my mother. Her voice was warm but hesitant. "Your father saw the photo," she said. "He didn't say much, just that you looked like you belonged there." I sat in my car for a long time after that, listening to the message on repeat. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't pride, but it was something. And for the first time since that night at the banquet, I realized something simple and true: silence doesn't always mean rejection. Sometimes it means a man's pride hasn't learned the language of love yet. Still, I couldn't wait forever. By the next morning, I was already packing again. New orders, new mission. That's how we live in uniform, always moving, always ready. But something inside me had shifted. The sting was still there, but softer now. Less like a wound, more like a scar that stopped hurting when the weather changed. I didn't need his approval to breathe. I just needed to keep walking forward. The flood mission changed everything, at least for the people watching. For me, it was another operation, another week of mud and exhaustion. But back home, it had turned into something else, a story. When I returned to the base, the public affairs officer was waiting with a stack of newspapers and an awkward smile. "Commander Cole," he said, "the nation's in love with you." I laughed, tired. Then the nation's got bad taste in heroes. He grinned, but didn't push it. The photo me pulling that kid out of the water had gone viral. I didn't mean for it to. Someone snapped it on a cell phone, and the next thing I knew, it was all over the local channels. Reporters wanted interviews, podcasts, quotes about courage. I said no to all of it. "Just doing my job," I told them. "The real story is the team." Still, the calls kept coming. Then the Department of Defense asked me to attend a recognition ceremony in D.C. I almost declined, but Commander Morales insisted. "You don't have to say much," he said. "Just stand there and remind people that service still means something." I went. I stood. They handed me a medal I didn't ask for. And when the applause started, I thought about my father. He would have hated that room: civilian donors, politicians in suits, speeches about shared values. After the ceremony, a reporter caught up to me. "Commander, what drives you?" she asked. "Responsibility," I said. "To your country, to people. Country's just where they live." She blinked. "That's not what most officers say. I'm not most officers." I didn't mean it to sound proud. It was just true. That night, I got back to my quarters and found a letter in my mailbox. No return address, but I knew the handwriting before I even opened it. "Saw your picture in the paper. You looked composed." I'll admit I didn't expect that. "Still think the Navy's not what it used to be, but you've done more than I thought possible." Dad. I read it twice. It wasn't praise. It wasn't even forgiveness. But it was something he hadn't given me in years: acknowledgement. I set the letter aside and lay back on my bunk. For the first time, I didn't feel angry, just sad. Because I realized that he and I were fighting the same war against our own stubborn pride. A few days later, I was back at work. The flood mission had earned me command of a joint training exercise in Florida, Operation Coastal Edge. Disaster relief coordination between SEALs, Marines, and local first responders. The kind of thing meant to look good on reports, but usually turned into logistical chaos. We arrived at the training site, a retired airfield turned temporary base. My team was mostly young. A few had never seen combat, but they were sharp, disciplined, eager to prove themselves. On the first morning I gathered them by the hangar. "You're not here to show off," I said. "You're here to learn how to hold the line when everything breaks. Titles don't matter. Branch doesn't matter. Respect does." Chief Daniels smirked. "That means we play nice with the Marines if they let you," I said. The group laughed, tension easing. The next week was brutal heat drills, late-night simulations. I pushed them hard, not for punishment but for precision. Flood rescues, medevac drills, comm coordination, every skill we practiced could mean life or death one day. By day 5, the friction between branches started showing. One Marine sergeant refused to take direction from a Navy woman. I caught him rolling his eyes during briefing. "Problem, Sergeant?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just wondering when we get real orders, ma'am." The room went still. I walked over, handed him a radio and said, "Good. You're running communications for the next drill. You'll take orders from whoever saves the most lives. Let's see if rank still matters when the water's at your chin." He blinked, but he did the job. Perfectly, actually. Afterward, he found me near the trucks. "Didn't mean disrespect, Commander," he said quietly. "I just never worked under someone like you." "Then it's about time you did," I said. By the end of the second week, the unit moved like one machine. Different branches, one purpose. That was the victory, not medals, not mentions. Just watching a group of strangers become a team. When the exercise wrapped, I stood on the pier watching the sunset. The sky burned orange over the water. I thought about my father again, about all the years he told me I couldn't belong. He'd always said the military wasn't made for people like me. Maybe he was right, but maybe it wasn't made until people like me showed up. That night, Daniels joined me with 2 mugs of coffee. "Ma'am, I saw your old man's name on the registry. He served at Fort Benning, right? Yeah. Why, met him once. Long time ago, before I enlisted. He gave a talk at my high school. Told us discipline was the only real inheritance a man could leave. Guess it runs in the family." I smiled at that small, tired reel. Maybe it skips generations. He chuckled. "Maybe it doubles back." We stood there for a while, quiet, watching the tide. The hum of the bass faded behind us. I thought about how far I'd come from that night at the banquet hall. He'd taken away a chair, but somewhere along the way I'd built a whole table. A week later, the Navy issued an internal commendation for the operation. I didn't hang the certificate. I tucked it into a drawer with the letter from my father. Some things are better felt than displayed. When I called my mother that Sunday, she said he saw the news again. Didn't say much, but he watched the whole thing. I didn't answer. I just stared out the window, thinking about all the times I'd wished he'd see me, and how strange it felt now that he finally might. Sometimes silence means someone's learning how to listen. 3 months passed before I saw my father again. It wasn't planned. It was my mother's idea, her 70th birthday. She'd called twice, left a voicemail that began with, "I know you're busy, honey," which meant she really wanted me there. I couldn't say no to her. So I drove home to Fredericksburg, Virginia, the same brick house I'd left at 19. The flag still hung from the porch, same as always. The grass was trimmed to military precision. Even the welcome mat said, "Discipline begins at home." When I parked at the curb, my father was already outside. He wasn't in uniform anymore. Retirement had softened him around the edges, but his posture was the same, arms crossed, chin up, eyes steady. "Commander," he said, like a greeting or a test. "Colonel," I replied. "Old habits die hard." We stood there for a beat too long. Then Mom opened the door, breaking the tension with her voice. "Well, will you two just stand there or come in and eat?" Inside the house hadn't changed. The smell of lemon cleaner, the photos on the mantel, the piano I was never allowed to play because it was your mother's space. I noticed one new frame, though, by the window. It was the newspaper photo from the flood mission. My father must have put it there because Mom would have placed it where guests could see it, not hidden in sunlight. Dinner started fine. My mother talked about neighbors' church gardening. I let her fill the silence, grateful for the normalcy. My father hardly spoke. When he did, it was about safe things, weather, traffic, politics. We danced around the elephant in the room. Until the doorbell rang. It was Major Daniels, the same man who'd served under me in Texas, now in D.C. on assignment. He'd stopped by with a bottle of bourbon and an easy grin. "Didn't mean to intrude, ma'am. Just passing through, thought I'd drop off this." My father's jaw tightened. "You two know each other?" "Yes, sir," Daniels said. "Commander Cole led the Houston mission. Best CO I ever had." The compliment hung in the air like gun smoke. My mother smiled politely. My father reached for his drink. Well, he said heroics don't make you a soldier. Daniels blinked uncomfortable. With respect, sir, they do when people come home because of them. I wanted to stop it, but part of me needed to hear where it would go. My father turned toward me. You always had people to defend you, didn't you, even as a kid? Never could take correction. I set my fork down. Correction's fine, Dad. Humiliation isn't. He leaned back in his chair, the old authority flaring in his eyes. You made your choices. Joined a branch that hides behind screens and committees. You think medals change that? I took a breath, steady but low. No, sir. My choices saved lives. That's what changes things. The room went quiet. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. My mother's eyes darted between us. Daniels looked like he wished he could disappear. Finally I stood. Excuse me. I walked out the back door and stood on the porch. The evening air was cool, thick with the smell of pine and rain. I heard the chair legs scrape behind me, my father following. You could have stayed at the table, he said. You could have let me. We stared at each other, the distance between us measured in years, not feet. His voice cracked just slightly. I don't know how to talk to you anymore. Then start by not tearing me down. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. You know, when your mother was pregnant, I prayed for a son. Thought maybe he'd follow me, keep the line going. When it was you, I didn't know what to do. Guess I still don't. It wasn't the apology I wanted, but it was a truth raw and small. Before I could answer, a sound came from inside glass, shattering my mother shouting. We ran back in. She was standing over my father's glass now in pieces on the floor. Enough, she said sharply. Richard, stop it. She's not your competition. She's your daughter. He looked stunned, like she'd just issued an order he couldn't countermand. For once, he said nothing. We helped her clean the glass. Then we sat awkwardly. The storm passed, but the air still thick. After a few minutes, Daniels quietly excused himself. I walked him to the door. She's tough, he said softly. But you're tougher. Don't let him forget that. I don't want him to, I said. I just want him to stop needing proof. After he left, I went upstairs to my old room. Everything was the same. The twin bed, the bookshelf lined with my mother's old poetry, the medals I'd hidden in a drawer after basic training because I didn't think they'd matter here. A soft knock at the door, my father's voice. You awake? I am. He stepped in slower now, careful. Your mother's sleeping. She wore herself out. I nodded. I shouldn't have said what I said, he murmured, about the chair, or tonight. I waited. He swallowed hard. When I see you in uniform, I don't see the little girl I used to protect. I see the part of me that never learned how to be proud without taking credit for it. That's not fair to you. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just said thank you. He started to leave, then paused. You're still my kid, he said softly. That's what scares me. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the house settle around me. The ticking clock, the creak of floorboards. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like the space right before something finally breaks free. I didn't know it yet, but the next time we'd meet, he wouldn't be standing on his own 2 feet. It happened 2 weeks later. I was in my office at Naval Station Norfolk finishing a logistics report when my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in years, my mother's landline. Her voice trembled. Avery, your father collapsed. They're taking him to Mary Washington Hospital. Stroke, they think. The paper fell from my hand. My body moved before my mind caught up. Within an hour, I was on the interstate sirens screaming behind me as traffic cleared like the sea parting on command. When I reached the hospital, the smell of antiseptic hit first. The air was too bright, too sterile, too still. My mother sat in the hallway, hands clasped tight, eyes red. He's stable, she said, but he's scared. That word scared didn't fit the man I grew up with. My father wasn't supposed to fear anything, least of all his own fragility. I walked into his room. He was sitting up, IV in his arm, eyes fixed on the window like he was staring through time. For a moment I didn't see the colonel. I saw an old man who'd built his life on unbreakable rules and was suddenly breaking himself. When he turned toward me, there was no sharpness in his gaze, only confusion. They told me you were coming, he said quietly. Didn't think you would. I almost didn't, I admitted. He gave a weak smile. Fair. I pulled up a chair, the same act he'd denied me months ago, and sat. How bad is it? Minor, they say. Doctor called it a warning shot. He tried to laugh, but it came out thin. Guess I finally learned what that means. We sat in silence. Machines beeped steadily beside him, a rhythm of borrowed time. He looked smaller than I remembered. For decades he had seemed larger than life, voice-booming presence filling every room. Now he looked like the air might move him if it wanted to. He finally spoke. When you were born, I held you for maybe a minute before the nurse took you away. I remember thinking, this one's gonna be trouble. You were. Not the bad kind, just the kind I didn't know how to understand. I didn't interrupt. He wasn't giving orders now, he was confessing. I thought if I pushed hard enough you'd break the way soldiers are supposed to, he continued. Instead, you bent and kept walking. Every time you rose higher, it reminded me how small my world had become. His voice cracked. That's what I was fighting all along, not you, my own limits. Something in my chest softened. Not forgiveness yet, but recognition. He looked down at his trembling hands. When I saw that picture in the paper, the one from the flood, I showed it to a friend at the VFW, told him that was my daughter. I didn't tell him what I'd said to you before that. I couldn't. The nurse entered to check his vitals. She was young, polite, with a small navy tattoo on her wrist. Commander Cole, she said, glancing at me. Just wanted to say thank you. My nephew's alive because of you, Houston Flood Sector 7. He talks about it all the time. My father's eyes flicked to me wide, startled. The nurse smiled, finished her work, and left. The silence that followed was heavier than anything we'd said. He exhaled slowly. I pulled your chair because I couldn't stand the thought that you'd built one higher than mine. I met his gaze. There was always room at the table, Dad. You just never sat down. For a moment his eyes glistened. Then he reached for my hand, a gesture I'd never felt from him without instruction or formality. His grip was weak but steady. You think there's still time to change? He asked. Yes, I said, as long as we're breathing. The doctor came in explaining discharge procedures and follow-ups. When he left, my father leaned back and said, You're staying right, just for the night. I'll stay, I said. Mom's on her way with clothes. That night I sat by his bed while he slept. The steady pulse of the heart monitor filled the silence. I thought about all the years he'd spent teaching me how to stand tall, how to hold composure, how to salute, but never how to rest. Maybe this was the first time either of us had allowed stillness to mean peace, not weakness. Around midnight he stirred. You still there? Yeah. He smiled faintly. I used to tell the boys under my command, you can't rebuild trust by shouting over the rubble. You start by sweeping. I nodded, then let's start sweeping. He didn't reply. He just squeezed my hand once before drifting back to sleep. When morning came, I watched sunlight slide across the floor tiles. For the first time in years, I felt the weight between us lift, not vanish, but loosen like a knot being untied slowly, deliberately. Later that day, as I helped him into the wheelchair for discharge, he said something that caught me off guard. I thought leadership was about being followed. You made me realize it's about being trusted. I smiled. You're learning fast. I've got a good teacher, he said. At the exit, Mom was waiting with a blanket. She hugged me first, tight, then touched his shoulder. You two finally talking? Trying to, I said. She laughed through tears. Took a near-death experience to make you both civil. Typical. We got him into the car. As I closed the door, he looked up at me. You'll visit again. I will, I said. And I meant it. Driving back to base that evening, I rolled down the window. The air smelled of pine and sunlight, not antiseptic. My phone buzzed with messages, emails, updates, to-dos, but I ignored them. For once, nothing felt urgent. Some battles you win by standing tall, others by finally sitting down. That night, I wrote one line in my journal, forgiveness isn't surrender, it's strategy for peace. And maybe that was the mission I'd been training for all along. 6 months later, I was standing backstage at the U.S. Naval Academy Auditorium waiting for my cue. The Defense Leadership Forum had invited me to give the keynote on integrity in command. I hadn't planned to accept. I didn't like the spotlight. I preferred missions where the only audience was the wind. But Commander Morales had convinced me. It's not about fame, he said. It's about legacy. Speak so the next generation understands what leadership really means." I was adjusting my notes when a familiar voice behind me said, "Looks like you're still giving orders." I turned. My father was there, standing cane in hand, wearing a dark suit instead of a uniform. He looked older, but his eyes were clear. "Didn't expect to see you here," I said softly. "Didn't expect to be here," he replied. "Your mother made me, said it's time I learned to listen." "Smart woman." He smiled, always was. We didn't say more. The stage manager called my name. As I walked out, the applause filled the room. Rows of cadets in white uniforms stood at attention. I stood at the podium, the lights blinding, and looked out across the sea of young faces full of ambition, fear, and idealism. "Good morning," I began. My voice echoed against the vaulted ceiling. "They told me to talk about leadership. I could stand here and quote manuals, regulations, or codes, but leadership isn't something you memorize. It's something you earn, usually the hard way." A few heads nodded. I continued. "When I was a kid, I thought leadership was about speaking louder than everyone else. Later, I thought it was about rank. But I learned that true command is quieter. It's when people follow you because they trust you, not because they're afraid of you." The room was silent. I told them about the flood mission, the teamwork, the humility of watching young soldiers save strangers with nothing but grit and compassion. Then, without naming him, I told them about the chair. "Someone once told me I didn't deserve to sit at the table," I said. "And maybe they were right. Maybe none of us deserve the seats we're given. We earn them moment by how we treat the people who have less power than we do." I saw movement near the back of the auditorium, my father leaning forward, slightly listening. Really listening. I closed my speech with this: respect isn't inherited. It isn't guaranteed by blood title or medals. It's earned in the small, quiet moments when no one's watching. The question isn't who sits down first. It's who stands when it matters. Silence, then applause, steady, strong, sincere. But it was what happened next that I'll never forget. My father stood up, slowly with effort, using his cane for balance, the first to rise. Then others followed, cadets, officers, instructors, 100 uniforms standing in one motion. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed through the hall like a heartbeat. I froze for a second, trying to steady my breath. He wasn't saluting in the traditional way, hand to brow, crisp and formal. He simply stood, head high, eyes steady on mine. And that was enough. After the ceremony, people came up to shake my hand. Words like inspiring and powerful floated around me, but I barely heard them. I was watching my father, standing off to the side, waiting. When the crowd thinned, I walked over. "You stood," I said quietly. He nodded. "Didn't know if I remembered how." "You did." He looked down at his cane, then back at me. "When you spoke about earning respect, I realized I'd spent my whole life confusing obedience with honor. I demanded one because I didn't understand the other." "That's a hard thing to admit," I said. He gave a short laugh. "Yeah, guess I'm still learning." We walked out together. The campus was quiet, the afternoon sun turning the stone walls gold. Cadets were marching across the quad, their white uniforms crisp against the grass. My father watched them, then said, "You know, I used to think the best thing a man could leave behind was medals. I see now it's something else." "What's that?" "Peace," he said. "The kind you give to others by earning it in yourself." We reached the parking lot where my car was waiting. He hesitated before opening his door. "You remember that night at the dinner?" "I do." "I can't erase it, but if it means anything, I've spent every day since trying to deserve another chance to sit beside you." I smiled, small but real. "Then take it, Dad. Seat's been open the whole time." He grinned weakly. "You always were stubborn." Guess I came by it, honestly. When I dropped him off at home, Mom was waiting on the porch. She waved, eyes bright with pride. As I drove away, I caught sight of them in the rearview mirror, her hand on his shoulder, both watching me leave. For once, it didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding. That night, I sat alone in my office, the same place where so many of our arguments had echoed in silence. I looked at the old letter he'd written after the flood. Then I reached for my pen and added one line beneath it. He finally stood. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't victory, it was recognition. Sometimes the loudest apologies aren't spoken, they're seen. It's been 2 years since that day at the Naval Academy. I still remember the sound of those chairs scraping back, the soft thunder of respect moving through the room. My father's slow, deliberate rise that moment replayed in my mind for months. It became the sound of peace. He never fully recovered from the stroke, but he changed in ways medicine couldn't measure. He started volunteering at a veteran center downtown, helping younger men write resumes, listening to their stories, teaching them how to stand tall without shouting. Sometimes he'd call me afterward and say, "I used your line again, the one about standing when it matters." And every time I'd smile quietly. He and I spoke often now, not about ranks or records, but about people. One afternoon he called while I was inspecting the base's new recruits. "You still wear that Navy uniform every day?" he asked. "Most days," I said. He chuckled. "Guess I'll have to stop pretending the Army was the only branch that mattered." A pause then, in a softer voice. "You know, Avery, you made me proud. Never thought I'd say it, but you did." That was all he needed to say. Sometimes love doesn't sound like a declaration, it sounds like surrender. When he passed, it was early spring. Quiet, peaceful. I found his journal on the nightstand beside his bed. On the last page in his block handwriting, he'd written, "Leadership is when your daughter teaches you what your uniform never could." I didn't cry right away. I just sat there running my fingers over the ink, realizing that after all the years of silence, we'd finally spoken the same language: honor. At his funeral, they gave him full military honors. I stood beside my mother as the rifles fired the final salute. My SEALs were there too, 12 of them, the same ones who'd once stood for me. When the flag was folded and handed to my mother, she turned and offered it to me. "He'd want you to have this," she whispered. I hesitated. "It's yours." She shook her head gently. "He spent his life building rules. You built meaning. That flag belongs to the one who carried both." I took it, not as a trophy but as a symbol of reconciliation. After the ceremony, I walked to the old oak tree at the edge of the cemetery, the one he used to sit under during my childhood. I sat down, rested the folded flag on my lap, and whispered, "You finally sat beside me, Dad." It just took a while. The breeze moved through the branches, soft and forgiving. I closed my eyes and let the peace sink in. Months passed. Life found its rhythm again. One morning I received a letter from the Naval Academy. They were naming a leadership scholarship in my father's honor, the Colonel Richard Cole Service Award. The note ended with a request: "Would you be willing to write the dedication line?" I thought for days. I wanted something simple, something that captured what we'd both learned the hard way. Finally, I wrote, "To those who rise not for power but for purpose. To those who remember that dignity is a weapon stronger than pride." They engraved it on a brass plaque outside the lecture hall. I didn't attend the ceremony. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would feel like: the silence, the pride, the echo of everything we'd lived. Now when I visit the academy to lecture, I see cadets stop and read those words before they enter. Some nod quietly like they understand. Others just move on. Either way, the lesson stays. At night, when the base quiets and the sea breeze drifts through my window, I sometimes think about that first chair he pulled away. The scrape of wood against floor, the humiliation, the silence that followed. I used to think that was the moment that broke something in me. Now I know it's the moment that defined me. He taught me what kind of leader I didn't want to be, and in doing so showed me what kind I could become. We're all handed chairs in life, some pulled toward us, some taken away. The real measure of character isn't how loudly we demand a seat, but how gracefully we stand until it's offered back. That's what I tell my recruits now. When they ask how to lead, I say, start with respect, follow with silence, end with honor. Because revenge, if it's done right, doesn't destroy, it transforms. It turns pain into perspective, anger into endurance, and distance into understanding. It took me 36 years to see that, but when I did, it changed everything. Tonight I sit on my porch overlooking the bay. The waves move steady, rhythmic, like an old song I finally understand. On the table beside me lies my father's folded flag and my Navy cap. 2 symbols of service. 2 generations, 1 lesson. The porch light flickers as the sun disappears beyond the horizon. I raise my mug of coffee the same way he used to lift his glass at dinner. To you, Dad, I whisper. We both stood after all. I look out at the ocean where sky and water meet without division, and I feel something close to peace, earned, not given. Then, for the sake of those listening to this story, those who've carried their own battles quietly, I say this. If you've ever been told you don't belong, that you're not worthy, or that your seat has been taken, stand anyway. Keep your calm, keep your dignity, because one day the world will rise when you walk in, not because of what you say, but because of who you are. And when that day comes, remember, you don't need to pull anyone else's chair to prove your worth. You just need to stand and keep standing with honor. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe a daughter, maybe a father, maybe both. And if you believe like I do, that dignity is the purest form of strength, stay with us. There are more stories like this waiting for you here on Honor Line.